Hi, I'm Catherine Reid, and coming up next on the St. Paul Forum, I'm talking with Pat Plonski and Tom Gitaa about the Books for Africa project. That's next on the St. Paul Forum. Welcome to the St. Paul Forum. I'm Catherine Reid, and joining me today are Pat Plonski and Tom Gitaa of Books for Africa. Welcome.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks for coming today.
Thank you.
Pat, tell us a little bit. I was amazed to realize this week that Books for Africa is 25 years old, and it has roots here and elsewhere, but tell us just briefly, how did Books for Africa get started?
Well, yes, so we're happy to be celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, and we'll be having a big celebration here in St. Paul for that. We started 25 years ago when our founder, Tom Worth, traveled to a library in Jinja, Uganda, and he was very surprised to find that there were almost no books there. And so
it was a library, but there were no books.
Exactly.
Okay.
There were very few books. There were
Okay.
a few books. They took pains to point out that they had some books, but it was very small and they were dated. And so Tom was active with the publishing folks. He was an automobile car publisher, just sold his business. So he came back to Minnesota in 1988, met with some other publishers, and they created Books for Africa, and the first books were sent to Jinja, Uganda. And as I say, that was 28 million books ago. So,
28 million books ago.
Yes.
So, Tom, tell us a little bit about your involvement with Books for Africa. How did you come to be part of this story?
Yeah, actually, I've been in the U.S. for a number of years now. Came here for college and started working here, and eventually started an African newspaper called Mshale. So we normally cover activities related to the African community here in the state. And then also people are doing things related to Africa. So in the course of just our regular news coverage, I chanced upon Books for Africa about 10 years ago. And actually the way that happened was the founder, Tom Worth, subscribed to our newspaper.
Oh, very
Okay.
nice. So the
Yeah.
publishing connection continued.
Yes,
okay.
yes. He subscribed to our newspaper, and then he sent me a note, I believe, of an activity that Books for Africa was doing, I ended up attending just as I believe it was just in my private capacity, not as as newspaper or anything, and I fell in love with Books for Africa, obviously. Because of the mission and what it's doing. So ever since, after that initial contact, we just started covering pretty much most of the events that Books for Africa does. So whenever they have fundraiser, they might have a barbecue sometimes. We will go there and we'll cover, take some photos, put in the paper, and that's really how my involvement started. About going to 10 years now,
Wow.
I believe. Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this mission, because I think it's hard for some people to possibly get their heads around why is it so important to send our books so far away. And I really felt in listening to the story of the organization at the event I attended that it really became clear. But maybe, Pat, can you talk a little bit
Sure.
about that?
well, I think it's important because the books that we have here in Minnesota and across North America may not be useful to us anymore. They may, for whatever reason, they may be, typically they've been in a private library, they've been read and they're sitting on a shelf, or in a school or library environment, there may be a newer book that's out. A university student may be done with it. So we have books here that are useful, that are very useful in Africa. And so the trick is to get the right books to the right people, and so that they indicate what they want, and then we collect all kinds of books from all kinds of people and organizations. We sort them by volunteers and then take orders and get them to the right people. And it has been very successful from the standpoint that people on the receiving end in Africa have indicated that, yes, these books are useful. And we've been able to cash flow it and make it work financially and logistically, and working with people like Tom and the African diaspora, as well as many people who've been to Africa, Peace Corps volunteers and corporations, we're able to get the books to the right people.
You know, that topic of the diaspora, I think, first of all, could you define that so that our audience knows what that means? Either one of you, what is, and maybe from your own personal experience?
Yeah, for those of us who are like less, diaspora actually can include pretty much anybody who has ancestry back in Africa. So typically for us, Black people, okay? So it can also include African Americans. But for most practical purposes, when we say African diaspora, for us, we tend to refer actually to people like myself, maybe. We just came from Africa, either voluntarily or refugees, and are now based here, you know, in the last maybe 25, 30 or 40 years, not necessarily connected to the slave trade, for example.
Right,
okay.
But related to other conflicts and or opportunities. I mean, is it
Correct.
kind of both? And
Yeah, it's both, because like myself, I came here voluntarily. I came for
you came for
college.
it sounds like.
I came for college, and I ended up staying. But there are some, you know, most Kenyans, that's how most Kenyans came here. But maybe most Somalians came as refugees, for example, Liberians, Ethiopians as well. So it's a whole mix. But for us, when we say African diaspora, we tend to refer to the people who are born in Africa that are here now.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
It's great to have that definition, just because we're all on the same page, because I'm not even sure I would have had that definition.
Yes,
so thank you. And the part that I wanted to, in terms of the mission, there was a statistic that I just heard that you shared, which has to do with what's coming because of the change in the continent of Africa and globally what that means. So could you talk a little bit about what you know what I'm referring to, which is the youth of where our youthful population will be and what that means for our future?
Yeah. Well, Africa's a very young continent, and Tom can tell you more about probably the specific figures, but to make a long story short, it's a very young continent, and as a result, there's a lot.
Young in terms of human age.
Exactly, exactly.
Not in terms of the way we think
That's
of
right,
the country,
exactly,
of the
exactly. The
continent,
people there are younger as a demographic than in the United States or Europe or somewhere like that. And so there's, I think, as a result, dramatic need for educational content. And whether the content is provided in books or digital or you know, electronic format, it doesn't matter. What matters is that there's a need for information and educational content. We find that books remain, for now, the most cost-effective way to deliver educational content. We are looking at other means of delivering content, things like digital content, e-readers, computers, and things of that nature. But for now, as I say, the book is the coin of the realm. It's the most useful, it's the most cost-effective, and so most of what we are sending is in the form of books.
What really touched me, though, was the notion that there are children, and I'll just put it around, since I attended your event and the ambassador spoke from South Africa, he really was talking about the idea of both economic development and peace, and that these books are that tool. And those two things really touched my spirit. Since then, I watched, my daughter is in high school and she needed to watch Blood Diamond. You know, I had also I'd seen that movie many years ago when it first came out. Since then, I've read some Sierra Leone books, including Bite of the Mango, which is an incredible memoir by a young woman whose two arms were cut off. This idea that a child may have never touched a book and that this project affects us in that way. Could you speak to that combination of education, economics, and peace?
Yeah, education is very important. It's what can prevent conflict in indirect way, both direct and indirect ways. There's a story, somebody told me the story of Nelson Mandela, when he was in prison all those years. And when he came out, he was asked, hey, how are you able to survive all these years? And he said he kept reading this one book over and over again. That's what kept him connected. And you have to remember Nelson Mandela was in isolation. He was solitary confinement for most of the time that he was is in prison. And the way he survived, he said, is because there's this one book that he'd been given that he kept reading on and on again. So books normally have a very, if you're probably a reader like I am, books tend to have a very emotional connection to people. And it's really the way to impart knowledge. And that knowledge opens you to other worlds that you do not, that were not possible, not just your own. And it can show you what is possible. So beyond just what you're learning in school, people who tend to read a lot obviously have a better worldview, and they'll tend to, what's the word I'm trying to look for? They'll tend to avoid, not avoid conflict, but they will be more curious to see what is out there beyond what is being presented to them locally in the form of conflict and the like, and also just broaden their horizons. So for countries that, if you even look at different parts of Africa, the higher the education level of most of the African countries, the more educated the population, there is actually some kind of correlation with how conflict is being managed in those particular countries. Where conflict is a lot, where there is a high level of conflict, the education levels have actually been disrupted for many, many, many years. So they have not had time to catch up to education, to raise up the standards of education for their people, for our people, for those specific countries, which has become a breeding ground for a lot of conflict. If you remember what the ambassador was saying of South Africa, was that we need to take care of the youth, because the youth can become easily breeding grounds for conflict. Influence for politicians. People who are busy trying to plant the seed of discontent and the like. So that's, we're just playing our little role in that.
It's very very interesting, and he used the term "end the book famine." And so one of the things, again, that what was the first number you just gave us? How many million books later?
Yeah, we've sent over 28 million books to 49 countries.
Much of which, and again, you're in 2 locations. Minnesota is the founding founder, but you're also St. Paul, literally, and then Atlanta is the other?
Atlanta's our large warehouse is in Atlanta.
You have a warehouse there.
So we have an office in Lowertown, St. Paul here, and then we have a warehouse at University in Pryor, sort of a regional collection site for books, and then we have a large warehouse in Atlanta where everything's collected and palletized and shipped to Africa.
If you're just joining us, I'm talking with Pat Plonski and Tom Gitaa about Books for Africa. So there's this notion of, when you're thinking about it, again, I have a hard time. I have a lot of books. I need to get rid of a lot of books. We know where they're going next. But, the physical aspects of books. Books are heavy, all the things. And again, there are multiple ways for people to participate. Can we just talk a little bit about these logistics that you've figured out with that many books? And I want to talk because I have interviewed Jote Tedesse on the show, and we talked only a little bit. They can look it up online. There's an archive of the interviews. But he talked about his passion for this work because of his experience coming from Ethiopia. It's helping people understand both ends of this, both the physical aspects of getting a container of books over and all the sorting and things you're talking about. But what happens on the other end as well? Maybe you can take the front end and you can take the back end?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, you said it right. Books are heavy, and it costs money to move them around, but it's still cost effective. It's more cost effective to move existing books than it is cost effective to reprint books, and they have to be moved also, because much of the publishing now, for economic reasons, takes place in China and in India. There's still publishing in Europe and the United States, and very good publishers everywhere. But books are moved around in under any circumstance. We just happen to move them to Africa from the United States. So the logistics are that, yeah, we probably have about 2 million books or more in our warehouse in Atlanta in inventory at any given time. Last year we moved about 2.2 million books to 22 African countries. The biggest recipients of those books were Nigeria and Ethiopia, which happen to be the 2 largest population centers on the African continent also. So that makes
they
sense.
are the 2 largest.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that
Yeah,
about
Africa
Ethiopia.
is number one. Some Nigerians say if you haven't been to Nigeria, you haven't been to Africa, because it is such an important country.
Such a large, and I did not really.
Yeah, 1 in 4 African people in Africa right now, in the continent, 1 in 4 Africans is a Nigerian.
Really?
Yes,
Wow.
yeah,
Okay.
And English of 100 million.
And that's another,
speaking.
and English speaking too, which
Right.
I think is another. I mean, I think there's so many things we have to re-educate ourselves about too.
Yeah,
So
the
that's
old,
helpful too.
Sort of as the the old British Commonwealth countries, English was left behind as sort of a unifying force, I think, in countries, a unifying language. And so even after the Europeans went home, the language continues to be used by Africans as it's deemed useful as a unifying force. But not everywhere. Somewhere it's Arabic, some places it's French, some places indigenous languages are enough of a unifying force. But where English is spoken, English books are needed, and so that tends to be places like Nigeria and Ethiopia, Ghana, a number of other countries. There's probably 10 to 15 countries where English is prevalent, and we send a lot of books. And then there's other countries where maybe other languages are prevalent, but they want to learn English because it's sort of a gateway into the world economy and tourism and things of that nature. So to have English is deemed on the African continent as a useful skill, wouldn't you say, Tom?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, there's actually a lot of important things, important developments going on right now in Africa. So, for example, some of the major countries, like if you take Senegal, for example, Senegal is French-speaking. But of late, they have actually been aggressively trying to, and actually President Obama is visiting there early next month, July. They just announced, the White House just announced 2 days ago that the president will be visiting Senegal, Tanzania, and South Africa a week before July 4th.
Wow.
So, so Senegal has been really getting aggressive in getting English books and promoting the speaking of English in there, because they are recognizing that, English is, especially if you're doing trade with the United States, for example, English is important. So they have started having that as one of the languages that they are promoting aggressively there. And Rwanda actually, which has been French-speaking for many years, since the genocide, after the genocide, they have really gone more into adopting English as their preferred language now. Because also they are very well, they just got integrated into what we call the East African community. And East African community is mostly English speaking, which includes, is modeled almost kind of like the European Union for that region. So they have started adopting English
and
more.
we can put our minds around that too. Around just this morning, there's a conversation about politics in Minneapolis and the nomination or the endorsement of a someone from, I forget which country, but he's
Somalia.
He's Somalian.
Yes,
okay,
yes.
and that it is an East African community from which. So again, I think we can just make these. What I love is that we can make these associations to bring it down to us physically here, but this very distant relationship. So there's this sort of breathing back and forth. So just briefly, because I want to make sure we cover just a couple things. So you need an army of volunteers, you need an army of donors, and no book is irrelevant at this point. You'll decide if they're irrelevant. So there are places to drop them off, and will that be something we can just put up on the website where they donate those?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, but then there's this sorting. I'm curious about this sorting and cataloging process. So, is that something that volunteers do? That they and I'm kind of thinking about my neighborhood secondhand bookshop, which I can go online and look up what they have, whether they have the book I'm looking for. Is that something you're doing where you said they order a certain kind of book? Is it more like an age range? Is it subjects? How does that work?
Well, the books come in, as you say, in all kinds, and some are useful, some are less useful. Publishers are donating books also. It all comes together ultimately to our warehouse in Atlanta, where the first sort is whether this book is useful in Africa, yes or no. If the answer is no, it goes into recycling, and probably a third of the books go into recycling, and that's okay.
That's true of if you were to go to half-price books, they're going to recycle a number of your books too.
The goal isn't to send every book to Africa, whether it's useful or not. The goal is to send books that are useful. And so the first question is this book useful? If the answer is yes, then it goes into inventory. And to keep it simple, we have approximately 4 categories and then a number of subcategories, things like primary level math or university level geography, things of that nature. And then, when the orders come in from Africa, they select based on some 35 categories, and then that's how we fill their orders.
Great. And then another way for them to help is to, you could purchase, you try to raise the money to ship a container, and can you just give us a flat number for what that goal looks like? Do you talk about that dollar?
It varies depending on where the container is going. So Tom is originally from Mombasa, Kenya. We can send a container of 22,000 books. It's about the size of a semi-trailer truck.
Right.
So we can put that in Mombasa for $10,300.
Okay.
If Tom were from Juba, Sudan, that price might go up to $25,000.
Oh, so a big range.
It's a big
it's
continent,
a huge continent,
but the cheapest, best way to get books to Africa is actually to serve the water ports, which is an issue that we grapple with, because that means more geographically remote areas are, have less education. It's nothing new in the world,
but it's a challenge. And then I want to talk about that other end, and we'll have maybe a few pictures from the Ugandan project that we'll show. So some people are physically helping you build libraries in Africa. Some of people are helping create the welcome party essentially for the books themselves. And then there's also the task, which Jote talks about, which is helping actually make sure that library is staffed and cared for in the long run. How do you see all of that, Tom?
Yes, actually. So there are actually two sides here. So there is this part here where we do our best to get the books collected, sorted out, and packaged and put in the container on the boat. Once they reach on the other side, there are other partners on the other side, the recipients. So for example, like what we talked at our last event, the Uganda project. So there has to be somebody on the other end who is going to receive the books and make sure that they get into the proper schools and the libraries that they need to get to. And these are normally very dedicated people. I think the good thing with Books for Africa, and why I really love working with Books for Africa, is we don't dictate where the books are going. Typically, somebody finds us. In this case, it can be the diaspora that we just talked about, or Americans who have traveled to Africa, to a specific village maybe, or a specific school, and they come back and they say, man, I just went to this library and there are just no books, just like the founder did back in '88. So they'll come find us, and then we'll work something out and see how best to get the books to that particular village or school. But that particular village or school has to participate actively with us in filling out what do you need. As Pat said, there are 4 subcategories. They are the ones who have to tell us, okay, we are actually looking specifically for math, for primary level or secondary level, high school science books. That's what we need. So we can send things they actually need.
Those things there.
Because when you send something that people have actually asked for, they are more likely to be taken care of and put in the proper library and stuff like that. So that's what happens. On the other end, they receive them. It's normally a big celebration for most of the recipients. It can take the form of even a big party, actually. you know, because the truck can come in, you know, carrying the whole container, and then they might even call it a day off for school, almost like a snow day for us over here, because the books
book
have
day.
arrived. Yes,
Okay.
you know.
Library day.
Yeah, and then they will, you know, distribute the books. You'll see pictures of kids carrying the boxes, you know, containing the books, and then they'll all
And
be
then they
assigned.
physically have them in their hands.
They'll have them in their minds and put them out in the different shelves that they go to. It's quite an event, to be honest with you.
I'm sure it's phenomenal.
It's quite
yeah.
an event.
Wonderful.
Yes.
So the 25th anniversary is coming up. Do you have a date for that event yet? That
Yep.
is.
Yep, we
What-
do actually have the privilege of co-chairing that with my friend Doris. Yeah, September 20 is the big gala. We actually
September 20.
we have related events like the event you just attended with the South African ambassador last week. That's actually part of the 25th anniversary theme
Great.
for this year.
So you're in the process
yes.
of getting that message
Correct.
out.
Yeah. So we are you know, slowly celebrating with small activities along the way. But the big day is Friday, September 20, at the Crown Plaza here on Kellogg
Wonderful.
in St. Paul.
Wonderful.
You know, and if you go to booksforafrica.org/events, you can get a ticket there and
Sponsor a table.
sponsor a table.
Become a
come join us. We'll
buy
have
a container.
There'll be a bazaar. There'll be a bazaar of all of African artifacts that you can buy. There'll be an African fashion show. They will, of
Very
course,
fun.
there'll be. We even actually worked very closely with the Crown Plaza, which is new for them. They'll have an African-inspired cuisine for that day, which is very rare, you know, for a lot of these chain hotels. But
Yes.
they made an exception for us, and we're looking forward to the big day. So booksforafrica.org/events.
Okay, we'll put that up.
Yeah.
So it's an opportunity for people to both honor the relationship to St. Paul and to Africa and be part of Books for Africa. Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. Come join us again next week.